Hey, welcome back to another dispatch from Holly McKay. Today we're going to ask Holly one question because you were just in Ukraine and you were just in the eastern part of Ukraine. And the burning question on everybody's mind, what's life really like there right now?
So I was really focused. I was with a group called the Mozart Group, and it's sort of it's a humanitarian aid organization, but they do training in other places for Ukrainian fighters. But the sort of the part that I was sort of concentrated on was with the evacuations team and with the sort of the humanitarian team, and we were going in and out of a place called Bakhmut, and it's in the Donetsk Oblast of the Donbas region. And it's sort of one of the really big focal points now for Russian bombardment, specifically the Wagner Group, which is the private military company that Russia kind of employs to do its heavy lifting around the world. But being in this, mind you, this is essentially an abandoned city. It was a city of around 75,000 people. It's hard to kind of estimate how many are left because people are living underground, but sort of a rough estimate would be sort of somewhere between 10 to 15,000 people still living there who really refuse to leave. But it was absolutely, I mean, if you could define anything being hell or apocalyptic, that is how you would define Bakhmut. I mean, there wasn't a single building really that was not touched. Every building, if it wasn't sort of blown apart, its windows were blown apart, doors were ripped off, it was burned. There is absolutely no electricity, no heating, no power, no cell signal, no running water. I mean, it's just unfathomable to think people are still living in these sorts of conditions and how they sort of get through. It's wild, really. And yet, and on top of all of that, you just have persistent bombardment. So, I mean, it really is from dusk to dawn, just shelling. It's just the sounds of artillery, and so often, the artillery is hitting very close to you. And I know in my experience with the Mozart team, it's sort of that very uncomfortable sensation of that whistle. I mean, anyone who's sort of been under bombardment by missiles, you hear this whistle, and then you have these like 2 seconds of silence where you don't know where that missile landed, and then you hear the explosion. But when you're close enough to hear the whistle, that's when it is a big cause for concern. It's going over your head and it's about to land somewhere near you. But this, for people in Bakhmut, it's constant, constant, constant. And just sort of that the sound of a war that people just, I think, adjust to. And it's sort of one interesting reflection I had on it was, there is sort of this momentary relief that you might feel in hearing a weapon that is outgoing. You know that Ukrainians are firing it out toward the Russian front lines further east, but then within that, the sort of few seconds of relief is quickly surpassed for this idea of, well, that a barrage is going to come back. So it is this way that people live, and yet what fascinates me is that the people that you see, they're still trying to do these normal things. They're trying to walk their dog. They're trying to go to, maybe the one store that's still open. And we'll get to that one store in a minute. But they're sort of trying to act as if life is sort of normal in some way. And yet it's so far from normal that it's just sort of hard to imagine. And yet nobody reacts to the missiles. Nobody reacts to the shelling. Nobody even, when you hear even small arms fire, which means that that the Russians are very, very close if they're having, these sort of small arms fire exchanges. And yet I think there's either a sort of a complacency or a normalcy or just this acceptance of death. And when you talk to people, and majority of people living there are older people that have, lived there their whole life. Maybe they don't have any family, they don't have anywhere to go, and they're not willing to sort of walk away. And the reaction that you'll often hear is, we know we'll probably die here, and that's okay. They would rather die there, I guess, in their homes in some sort of semblance of dignity, as opposed to having to flee and to be a displaced person and to live in a sort of a shelter or a camp or something somewhere. So you sort of see this incredible resilience, if you will. At the same time, also craziness, because you are literally living in a front line. But the other thing that I think can't be ignored is the fact that a lot of people, and I hesitate to say a lot because it's hard to sort of put your finger on it, but at least a portion of people that are still living there are pro-Russian. For example, the one store that I sort of mentioned, there was one store that was sort of half functioning that I saw in Bakhmut, and it had been shelled the days before and blown apart for the large part, but yet the owners of the store, that basically a day later they'd reopened it. And when we went in there to get these energy drinks, they sort of said, well, the Ukrainians are shelling us. We're Russian. We speak Russian. And it sort of brought home to you this sort of warped sense of how people, even living in Ukrainian territory, still see the war, and that they weren't able to really decipher where the positions were, to know that it really wasn't Ukraine that was shelling them, it was Russia. And yet they were so steadfast in their support for Russia that they were sort of weren't willing to kind of leave or to go anywhere else. So there are a lot of sort of uncomfortable realities on the ground that you do see. But what I will say, with my time with TMG, is they're really an organization that's going where no one else is going. I mean, I don't see the UN, I don't see the Red Cross, I don't see all these other groups that are sort of internationally hailed for their work, which they do very important work, don't get me wrong, but there really isn't anyone else that's willing to sort of fill that critical gap and go that extra mile and drop food to the people still living there, or help escort them out when they finally do make that decision to leave, and they do need help, navigating these blown out roads and getting across the river because the bridge has been blown out. So that's sort of what they do. But it really does, it's sort of this big black void of help for anyone who's sort of made that decision to stay there. It's basically, you're in a military zone now, you're on your own.
Mm, okay. Wow. So me just quick yes no answers to some basic questions here. Are these people living above ground or underground for the most part?
I mean, you certainly see people above ground in the sense that they're lighting fires outside because that's their only chance to get any kind of warmth, or maybe to cook something, or so during the day, a little bit, you will see people that are sort of living, on street level, if you will. But I think for the most part, people are living underground. Like when they go to sleep at night, they are trying to sleep in the basements if they have one. But mind you, when you go to sort of the east side of the city, which is closer to the Russian front line, these are just very simple houses. They don't necessarily have basements or have uh, you know, bomb shelters or anything like that. You see a little bit more of that on the west, where there are sort of apartment sort of style, larger skyscrapers and things, well, not skyscrapers, but multi-story buildings. But on the east, you don't really see any of that. It's very, very simple sort of homes, and so I can't imagine that there is anywhere down for people to go. So they are sort of living with this threat of shelling. And mind you, every single home, as I said, is destroyed. So it is this strange game of Russian roulette. Well, when will that shell be the one that sort of hits me? And it's very uncomfortable. But yet these people have still living there have oftentimes become very comfortable, I guess, with being there. And that's sort of a sad reality. And there was one woman, and she was 93 and she was blind, and the sort of Mozart team kept kind of going to her to check on her when she was alive. Did she want to leave? Can they help her leave? What does she need? Does she need water? Does she need fuel? Does she, what can be done? And she just said, just stop bothering me. I'm not leaving. And this is my home. I'll die here. I'll stay here. And the scary thing is, when you look at someone who's 93 and blind, um, as the winter sets in, that snow is going to pile up outside her house, and she's going to eventually be snowed in. And that means there is no way to even go out and get food or collect rainwater or whatever it is. And that is a scary kind of thought that a lot of people have resigned themselves to for winter. That's also been the reason why some people have chosen to be evacuated in recent weeks, because they don't want to be hemmed into their homes if they don't have the strength to shovel snow alone. If the man of the house is not there, which often case, you do sort of see a lot of women living alone, that are still staying there. So it's just this sort of multifaceted, I guess, reason for people that they they're just determined to stay. And that may change as the winter kind of really does set in and you don't have any heat. It's already brutal enough, and I can only imagine in a month's time how much more brutal it is going to be. But yeah, for from different reasons, people are not willing to leave, and some will say, look, we left, but we were promised that we would have rent-free places to stay, and they realized that that wasn't the case, so they sort of came back. And in one case, a woman, her husband was hit by shrapnel and was then in the hospital, and so there are certainly ramifications for that happening, and it's sad, but it's also important to remember that these people feel that this is their home, and you certainly, it's a sensitive subject, but you can't force people to leave. But essentially the whole city is a military base, and I guess that's a risk that they're just willing to take.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, based on the scenario you told me, I fear a number of those people are going to freeze to death this winter, but which is sad. Last question. As you noted, there are the allegiances of the people in the area continue to be split. Some Ukrainian, some Russian leaning in terms of their leanings. But the irony, as a last comment, of the two composers, Wagner versus Mozart, being the organizing entities that are currently raging in the Donbas Donetsk region at each other. What do people think about the poetic irony of that?
I mean, I think that's, why Andy Milburn is a friend of mine who founded the Mozart Group. That is why he, chose that name. It was a little bit, I guess, tongue in cheek, but yeah, the irony of that is that, it's hard to paint things black and white, but you certainly have a good versus evil. So, and not to say that well, not to sort of paint things that simplistically, but I think that is sort of the case here is one country invading another, and it's sort of hard to argue with that. And so you sort of have one group in one hand that's trying to do the best they can. They aren't armed, and then you have another sort of armed mercenary group that is willingly taking on a bulk of the destruction of its neighbor.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. Two composers, or poetically, two composers, and the drum beat is measured in percussion instruments that measure about 122 millimeters in diameter that go bang every few seconds. Terrible irony. I mean, that it's strangely poetic and sadly poetic, actually. Thanks, Holly. I mean, that's a very deep description of what's going on in the eastern part of Ukraine at the moment, and the fact that you went there, saw it firsthand, is a credit to your journalism. So thank you for sharing that with everyone.
Please do read the article.
Take care.
Thank you.